What is going on, everyone? Lauren Sisler here with AL.com, cruising into week 11 of the college football season. Y'all, can you believe it? Week 11. We are in November, and perhaps a November to remember. We'll see how that goes. Alabama escaping LSU 20-14 with a win in Bryant-Denny Stadium. We want to thank our sponsors first and foremost. Keep Alabama beautiful. Thank you for rolling with us all season long. And want to thank Mike Rodak, who joins us now to break things down as he's been traveling all over the place with Alabama all season long, and what has been much different season than we saw a season ago. So I know it's a grind. I know it's a long season, but we appreciate obviously your coverage and just bringing us all the latest news and notes from Alabama's matchup with LSU. So first and foremost, just give us the shakedown of just your thoughts, your biggest takeaways from this Alabama win over LSU, because I think a lot of people coming into this one, obviously some big time question marks with LSU not being the team that Alabama's accustomed to playing in recent years. Ed Ogeron last week in their bye week was saying, oh, we're all hurt. We're banged up. We don't have enough guys to field a scrimmage. And then they come in here and put up 14 points and, Alabama's only able to put 20 on the board and certainly limiting them to very few yards on the ground. So give us your biggest takeaways for this one.
Yeah, I mean, the 14 points, I think, was probably in line with expectations, at least in my end, in terms of what LSU would do. I mean, Max Johnson came into the game as one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC, even with, pretty limited weapons around him. And, I think they were going to score a couple times. I don't think that was really the surprising part of the game. I think it was the offense, and it continues to be the offense. And it's been so up and down, even within games, that it's hard to really make, big, wide declarative statements about the offense. But they have some really weird stretches where they just can't move the ball. They're committing really dumb penalties. They're not turning it over a ton. I mean, Bryce Young had a couple games in a row there where he threw picks, but they're not really losing the ball too often. And there's not that sort of struggle. It's just like they come out and they go 3-0. And then they did it 4 times in the second half of a game where it really was tight and they had a chance to kind of put it away. And you just didn't see that out of the offense last year, really the last 3 years before this, I would say. And that's kind of the strange part to me. And that was what made this game so close. And, I think the defense continued to play really well. I know people kind of want to harp on Pete Golding. I don't think that was really the issue here. I think he gave up 14 points against LSU. I think that's all right. Especially with the stops that they made down the stretch when things were really tight and they needed to make those stops. They did a good job of that. It's still the offense to me. The running game putting up only 6 yards. And now it's a little bit, I don't say it's a strange stat because it's so low, but it's really because of the sack yardage that gets taken out of there. So it's misleading to some extent. They really had about 50 rushing yards. Once you take away the 4 sacks and the yardage after that, in college football, that counts against your rushing yards. In the NFL, it counts against your passing yards. So, it certainly was not a good rushing performance by any means. They did have more than 6 yards though, when all is said and done. So, is that the problem? I don't know, because they could come out next week or this week against Mexico State and run for 200 yards. And they've had games this year where they've run for a bunch of yards. The Ole Miss game is one of them. Like, they've shown they can run the ball this year. It was just one of those games where they couldn't. And then when they tried to pass the ball, outside of the Jamison Williams 58-yarder there, it wasn't the greatest passing night either.
Yeah, and I think, it's just kind of that spark and just that we go in and we win with ease and there's no question about it. And again, Alabama and LSU, this matchup always creates fits. This always creates issues for Alabama. But this year, more than ever, just what they're dealing with. Coach O's out after the season. So much turmoil there at LSU. Obviously, as you said, Max Johnson played well, but doesn't have a ton of weapons behind him. There's not a ton of depth on both sides of the football for LSU. So certainly, I think the thought process is Alabama should be able to score against them pretty handily. And that obviously wasn't the case, wasn't able to get in a rhythm. So here's the question. Nick Saban, after the football game, everyone kind of gets prepared for what Nick Saban is going to say or what his mood is going to be after a game like this. And a lot of times we've seen Nick Saban when it's a complete blowout. A lot of times he's not overly thrilled. He finds the mistakes, finds things that he's not overly happy about. And then when it's really close, you find a Nick Saban that is, we made it through, like, given all the positives. I don't know. I feel like this time around, Nick Saban just a little bit different than maybe people expected after a 20-14 win over LSU. What's your takeaway from his mood after the football game?
Yeah, I think it was the sort of game that he likes, just being a defensive coach and an old school coach. And this is the sort of game that they would have played 10, 12, 14 years ago when he first got to Alabama. And that's kind of how college football was played back then. And I don't know if it's just nostalgia from him, but when you have the defense that came up with all those stops towards the end of the game, I think that's certainly something that he likes to see, probably more than the shootout like you had against Florida last year, where it was just up and down the field, no
Right.
defense, all offense, and that was kind of how it looked like college football was going, but not totally this year. I mean, look at what Georgia's doing as a number one team in the country. That's a defensive team, and they're the favorites to win the national title with a backup quarterback and a really, really good defense. And maybe Nick Saban thinks that if his team can kind of replicate that, they got a shot against Georgia. And he even said this. He said, like, the offense as a whole this year has put up a lot of points and done really well, and he's right about that. So maybe it's just a thought that this is an isolated incident for the offense. Again, is it? There's been parts of games where it hasn't been, like the Florida game. There were some really bad stretches of offense. The A&M game, there were some bad stretches of offense. The Tennessee game, like they fall into these ruts where it's not an offense that can move the ball. I think you see a lot of screen passes, a lot of work in the outside part of the field, but there is a difference when you're throwing to John Mechie and Jameson Williams and Brian Robinson on the outside part of the field, and they're getting 3, 4, 5 yard gains versus what they had the last couple of years. You throw to DeVonta Smith or Waddle, and they're turning those screen passes into 10, 15, 20-yard gains. I mean, that makes a difference. And the offensive line obviously makes a difference, I think, for the running back and kind of what they were able to do with Najee last year pretty consistently versus, what they've done this year with Brian Robinson. So there's differences there, but I think Nick Saban's really good at playing good cop, bad cop. And like you said, when things are going well, he tends to kind of deflate them and keep their egos in check. And when things aren't going well, which I think we can all agree that was not, the most convincing win for Alabama, then he tends to do, a lifting up of their spirits and try to keep them even keeled. And that's just kind of how he operates as a coach.
Yeah, definitely. And, again, I think a lot of people, the comparison game, I mean, it's certainly going to be there. It's always going to be there when you try to compare teams from one year to the next. And, oh, what is going on with this Alabama football team? Can they win a national championship with the type of performance that they're putting out on the field like they did this past weekend? And I think that is a big question. So that gets me to our final talking point here. Road to the SEC championship and college football playoff. When you look at the schedule as a whole, Alabama home this week against New Mexico State. That's an 11 a.m. kickoff on SEC Network. Of course, again, this is one of those games that you might see the mood shift for Nick Saban of, this could be a trap game. We're not going to go into this lightly, that sort of mindset. So, of course, we might see a different Nick Saban as we cruise into this week. And, of course, we'll have his press conference here in about half an hour. But then after that, it's home against Arkansas, which is Arkansas is a much improved team, have showed that they can compete at a high level. So you can't look past them. And, of course, you go on the road to Auburn, Jordan-Hare Stadium. Auburn did not have a great performance against Texas A&M, lowest offensive output for them. But we've seen Auburn really hit some peaks this year. So what does the road, in your opinion, look like? And obviously we know that the likelihood of them, if they win out, meets with Georgia in the SEC championship game. But just your overall thoughts on what this looks like for Alabama right now as they get closer to the SEC championship and college football playoff.
Yeah, it's kind of a case of you have this Alabama-Arkansas game coming up, and that's going to be a 2:30 CBS kickoff, which I haven't had too many of those this year. That just came out. So we'll have to see. Arkansas hasn't played nearly as good football in the second month of the season as they did in the first month. But you get past that game, and then you're essentially at two playoff games, I would say, against Auburn and then against Georgia if you make it that far. And they haven't won in Auburn. I think it was Greg McElroy said the other day that they've won 3 national championships since the last time they won in Jordan-Hare Stadium. So that's always tough. We'll have to see how Auburn does the next couple of weeks against Mississippi State and South Carolina. We'll have to see how Texas A&M does against Ole Miss this weekend. But if there's wins there, then you go into that last week, really in a tough spot where you really need to win that game against Auburn in order to win the SEC West and make the SEC championship game. So there's a lot of scenarios right now. It does really require Auburn and A&M to keep winning if they truly want to have a chance, if they truly want to have a chance to beat Alabama and win the division. But then you get past that and it's Georgia, and it's a question of, can you afford a close loss to Georgia if you do win the next 3 games and you get to that Georgia game? Can you afford a close loss and still make the playoff? That's the other part of this question. And it's going to be interesting to see. I think if there is a year where a 2-loss team can make the playoff, this might be it. I think it will probably require Cincinnati losing a game. As much as the committee, seems hesitant to put them in the playoff, I think they would certainly put a undefeated Cincinnati team over a 2-loss Alabama team. I think it would take the Big Ten really continuing to beat up on itself, and that happened with Purdue beating Michigan State. And I think it would probably take Oklahoma losing. Like, there would have to be a lot that would happen. Oregon maybe losing again. But, if you play Georgia really close, then maybe Alabama's a shot to sneak into the playoff as a 2-loss 4 seed. But you really have to win that Georgia game as well if you want to feel good about making the playoff this year.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think there are a lot of scenarios, and certainly as we inch our way closer to the end of November, the scenarios aren't quite as clear cut. And I think that's the case all across the landscape of college football. We've seen it, this is that time of year where it's like every weekend, it's like, oh, another one down, or just, the expectation of a team going in and dominating, and then they come out with a lesser performance, obviously a loss, and you see the shuffle. And so I think it'll certainly be interesting, but, Alabama certainly, if they can play consistent football here in the month of November, obviously work on some of those deficiencies and prepare themselves for the SEC championship against Georgia, given that they win out, then I certainly think the road to, the championship is certainly there. But a lot of our viewers here kind of weighing in on that and feeling like this might not be the year, that this might not be the year for Alabama, especially with them having to play a Georgia football team that has just been, extremely dominant throughout the entire season with a lot of consistency. So we'll see how things shake out. Again, Alabama at home again this week, playing New Mexico State. That game 11 a.m. on SEC Network. We appreciate you, Mike Rodak, for joining us today for another edition of SEC Insider. We appreciate all you guys for watching. And, of course, we appreciate our sponsor. Keep Alabama beautiful. Peace out. We'll see you next time.